The United States Air Force has a proud heritage that has taken man from his natural habitat on Earth into the atmosphere and on into space. This heritage had its inception the day man made his first experimental flight. Heritage is made of strength, of conviction, of engineers and medals, and the dedication and achievements of men. Strong men who pioneer new concepts. Major General Benjamin D. Folloy. Men who dare to be uncommon. Brigadier General Billy Mitchell. Men with beliefs and visions whose bold decisions influence history. General Henry H. Arnold. Men with outstanding qualities of leadership. General Carl Spaatz. Men who by personal example and dedication inspire others. General Hoyt S. Vandenberg. Men who overcome conventional barriers and advance their profession into new frontiers of the unknown. General Nathan F. Twining. Men who respond to the challenge of military statesmanship. General Thomas D. White. Men who build for the advancement and security of their nation. The United States Air Force today is a $90 billion concern. 1,200,000 military and civilian Air Force men and women serve in the operation of thousands of aircraft and hundreds of ballistic missiles. There are over 200 bases in the United States and other Air Force installations overseas. The Chief of Staff is responsible for the direction of this force, for the management of its vast resources to maintain a maximum combat effectiveness in our changing and uncertain world. He must be an airman and a statesman, as well as a hard-headed manager.
I want to express our great pleasure at the assumption of this responsibility by General Lemay. He was one of the most distinguished combat commanders in World War II. He played a most instrumental role in developing SAC into its present high peak as the great shield of the United States and the free world. So, General, we want to say that speaking personally and also as President, that it's a great pleasure to welcome you as the new Chief of Staff of the United States Air Force and a member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff.
Mr. President, I appreciate very much you taking a time out from your busy schedule to participate in this ceremony. I'm sure you realize that a member of the armed services, becoming Chief of Staff of his service is the highest honor that can come to him.
To the extent that any one man can make a personal impression on an institution as large, complex, and changing as the United States Air Force, General Curtis E. LeMay made that impression. He began to make it years ago. The days of the leather hats were not yet over in 1929. But the days of flying fools, of daredevils, barnstormers, and early pioneers had all but passed. The men who have stuck by the air business, General Billy Mitchell had said in 1925, have gone through its darkest days. The power of the air, Mitchell said then, is gradually assuming the dominating role which the future holds in store for it. In 1929, what has been called a decade of patience and progress lay ahead. These were the years in which the modern Air Force was taking shape. These were also the years in which a new generation of military pilots emerged. In the class of 1929 at Kelly Field were General Samuel E. Anderson, Major General Samuel R. Brentnall, Brigadier General Edgar A. Surmeyer, Jr., Major General William L. Kennedy, Major General George F. Smith, Brigadier General Alfred R. Maxwell, Brigadier General Thayer S. Olds, Lieutenant General Francis H. Griswold, General Frank G. Everest, Jr., Brigadier General Emmett F. Yost, Major General Robert O. Cork, Brigadier General Laverne G. Saunders, Brigadier General William J. Clinch, General John K. Gerhardt, Lieutenant General William H. Tunner, General Emmett O'Donnell, Jr., Lieutenant General John R. Samford, and General Curtis E. LeMay. LeMay began as a fighter pilot with the 26th Pursuit Squadron at Selfridge Field. He met a girl named Helen Maitland there, and before they were married, he returned to Ohio State to complete his studies for an engineering degree. Later, he served with the 6th Pursuit Squadron and the 18th Pursuit Group in Hawaii. About the same time that LeMay began to fly, a small group of engineering and bombardment officers were quietly working at Wright Field to promote the conception of a low-wing, all-metal, multi-engine bomber. By 1936, when LeMay was assigned to the 49th Bomb Squadron at Langley Field, their work had culminated in the experimental YB-17A. At that time, as Hap Arnold later said, the Air Corps had the airplanes, accessories, installations, the gadgets, the technique, and the know-how necessary to provide air power for the United States. The stuff was there all right, but it was primitive and available only in limited amounts. In 1936, the Air Corps had a strategic bombing capability only in theory and on the smallest scale. B-10s were still frontline aircraft in those days. And those were the days when Hitler was cold-bloodedly preparing total war. We could have peace in our time, Hitler promised in September 1938. But Britain's Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain came home from Munich with only a scrap of paper in his hand. I want airplanes now, lots of them, President Roosevelt told his top military advisors the next day. For even then, in the fall of 1938, there were only a handful of B-17s in the Air Corps. Nevertheless, a flight of 6, one half the total number we had on hand, had taken off in February of that year on a long-range goodwill flight to South America. They flew 5,200 miles to Buenos Aires and safely home again. Among those who made this flight were many who had become air leaders in a war waiting to begin. A handful of pilots who would help to prove in World War II that air power was a decisive factor in modern war. Robert Olds led the flight. With him were Harold George, Caleb Haynes, Robert Williams, John Samford, Vincent Malloy, A.Y. Pitts, Cornelius Causland, and last, but by no means least, the navigator, First Lieutenant Curtis LeMay, who thus stepped briefly into the news for the first time. Only a few months later, when Hitler's pilots scrambled for their strike on Poland on the 1st of September 1939, there were still only 23 B-17s in the Air Corps. There was nothing to stop the Germans except an outmoded air force, equipped to fight the First World War of more than 20 years before. Led by the Luftwaffe, Hitler's Blitz destroyed not only Poland and the peace of Europe, but also the myth that we were safe beneath our own undefended skies. On that day, the decade of patience died. An era of breathless haste was born. We were not even sure of what we would need to fight this kind of war. How many men? How many factory workers would we need to put together? How many planes? In 1941, 4 young Air Corps officers made a staggering prediction. we would need, they said, 63,467 planes of all types and an air force of 2,200,000 men. Their estimate was just a little short of what it finally took to win the war. In 1939, the figures would have seemed incredible. But even then, the belated job of catching up had begun. Existing plants expanded to build the planes. Assembly lines began to roll. Somehow, the planes were built. Somehow, the men were recruited and trained. Between December 1939 and December 1941, the Air Corps' growth was phenomenal. From 17 bases to 114 bases, and still more in the mill. In these 2 years, a leap was made from training 300 pilots to training 30,000 pilots a year. The number of navigators, bombardiers, mechanics, and technicians grew at the same rate. And Lieutenant Lemay, a recent graduate of the Air Tactical School at Maxwell Field, became progressively involved in the expanding need to train and deploy the growing force. From B-17 airplane commander, he moved up to become a captain and operations officer of the 41st Reconnaissance Squadron. Then he became commander of the 7th Bomb Squadron, and later, operations officer of the 34th Bomb Group. He moved up again in March of 1941 to temporary major, and in the autumn of that year, he stepped briefly into the news once more. In a lone B-24, Lemay and Colonel Caleb Haynes pioneered a new transport route to the Middle East via South America and Africa. The success of this mission led to the birth of a regular transport service to Cairo, Egypt in November of 1941. 1 month later, however, another of Billy Mitchell's predictions came true. The Japanese, he had warned in 1935, will not politely declare war. Hawaii, for instance, is vulnerable from the sky. It's wide open to Japan. Yet we bring our Navy in at Pearl Harbor and lock it up every Saturday night. As I have said before, Mitchell insisted in 1935, that is where the blow will be struck. On a fine, quiet Sunday morning. And so it was. Lemay was at Westover then, still working to build and to train his part of that force, which, if it had been alert, might have prevented this. For all Americans, Pearl Harbor was a catastrophe. For men like Lemay, it was even worse. Everything in which he believed, both as an airman and a citizen, was hit by the violence and the effectiveness of the Japanese attack. Months would pass before anyone could strike back. In the fall of 1942, he took the 305th Bomb Group to England and into combat later that fall. As a colonel commanding the 305th, Lemay showed two concerns, later apparent in every command he had. The first was well publicized, a tough, aggressive determination to hit the enemy with maximum effect. For this and the discipline it took, they called him Iron Pants. But he had another side, his much less known but intense concern for the men assigned to him. He felt a deep responsibility for his air crews, and for this, those who were close to him called him Papa. Every innovation for which Lemay was cited had this purpose, to protect his crewmen and their planes so that they could drop the maximum bomb load on every strike and return safely home to strike again. Lemay was often the first to prove new techniques on combat missions he led. Defensive bomber formations, straight-in bomb runs, the use of lead crews, these and other innovations for which he was esteemed were saving graces, not flamboyant risks. In August 1943, he introduced another, This time he led the 4th Bomb Wing on the first shuttle raid, Regensburg. Their mission accomplished, he led them on to a landing in North Africa. For this, he won the Distinguished Service Cross. Later, on the following September 28th, he became a brigadier general. In July 1944, the air war in Europe had reached a crescendo, but the tempo of the air assault on Japan was just beginning to increase. At this time, Major General Lemay was ordered to the Far East, commanding first the 20th Bomber Command in India and China, and later the 21st on Guam. He directed the bombing of the Japanese islands. Again, as in Europe, he gave to his operations his distinctive touch. However heavy it may have sometimes seemed, the touch was always an essentially protective one. A push in the right direction toward the target with maximum bomb loads, then home to safety for another strike. The push, when it finally reached the target, delivered a more massive blow than LeMay had ever delivered before. His tactics, as always, were carefully planned and supported with an engineer's slide rule efficiency to reduce the loss of aircraft and of men. His chief innovations with B-29s were two. First, he brought down his attacking planes from high to medium altitudes. At maximum strength, the 20th Air Force Bomber Force consisted of 5 wings, almost 1,000 B-29s. Behind their success was another LeMay technique. To keep his bombers flying, he replaced the old crew chief idea with a system of centralized maintenance on each base. He also established an airlift for the resupply of critical parts. Together, these methods put each plane in the air 4 times as long as it might otherwise have been. And that, in effect, quadrupled the size of the 20th Air Force and multiplied its punch. But his second major innovation with B-29s was the introduction of night bombings by radar. These night raids compounded air defense problems for the Japanese and saved more of our planes and men. Behind this achievement lay another story, much less known than the general's combat record or his aptitude for management, much less familiar than his scowl, his chilling silences, and blunt remarks. No one knew it then, Lieutenant General William Blanchard later remembered. But when his planes were due back at Guam from the night's raid, he'd climb into a Jeep, drive to the control tower, and park alone in the dark. He'd tally the crews as they came in, airplane by airplane, name almost by name. Even before the crews debriefed, he knew who hadn't made it back. But no one realized this or knew what he felt. War ages men. War, LeMay said, is a very serious proposition. In a war, if you don't kill the enemy, he's going to kill you. And besides, every single day that this war lasts, I lose my men. I expect, he said, to shorten this war. And shorten the war he did, not only with the B-17s and the B-29s, but also as Chief of Staff to General Spaatz. With him, he helped to plan the atomic missions that led to the surrender of Japan. With the war finally at an end, LeMay flew home in a hurry. He piloted one of his B-29s on a non-stop record-breaking flight from Japan to the United States. He was home, but not for long. Early in 1946, as Air Force Deputy Chief of Staff for Research and Development at the Pentagon, he was among the first to conceive of the mixed force the modern Air Force has become. A mix of missiles and manned aircraft. He worked to keep those scientists who had served during the war. He worked to assure the Air Force the kind of weapon systems we would one day need. In April 1948, the Soviets pulled a switch to set up the Berlin blockade. The Cold War, intensified by this, would go on for years. General LeMay, at that time commanding U.S. Air Forces in Europe, built a team that in 11 months made over 750,000 flights into Berlin. The airlift, established in July 1948, delivered over 2.25 million tons of supplies. In an endless, uninterrupted flow, plane after plane came into Tempelhof with coal, clothing, medical supplies, milk, food, and the blockade was broken. Before this happened, however, LeMay came home to face another monumental task. The Strategic Air Command was barely 2 years old when General LeMay arrived to take command in the fall of 1948. 6 months later, SAC headquarters had moved to Omaha. 11 bomb groups and 54,000 officers and men. A first-line military force was rapidly being forged, thanks to LeMay and the men he had gathered for his staff. Tom Power, Augie Kistner, J.P. McConnell, Cam Sweeney, J.B. Montgomery, Roger Ramey, Rosie O'Donnell, Shorty Wheelis, Butch Blanchard, Jack Ryan, and others. Old hands who had served with him before. Strategic bombardment men, matured in combat. They continued to serve all through the years of SAC's transition from conventional bombers to jet B-47s and B-52s, and to a mix of manned aircraft and missiles. But LeMay gave SAC not only the leadership, the spirit, the combat efficiency he had developed in earlier commands, he adopted for SAC a new and far-reaching system of management control. And he made this work. When in June 1957 he turned over the command to General Power, SAC was the most highly organized, well-disciplined, and powerful military force the world has ever known. And all through the following years, SAC has remained a full and complete expression of the LeMay philosophy and of his touch. There was more to be done, however, and in 1957, LeMay went on to become Vice Chief of Staff. From that time on, his touch was felt throughout the entire Air Force. Just as his innovations had spread throughout the 8th and the 20th Air Force and SAC, so now their spread continued. To the Air Force as a whole, he brought his concern for the safety and welfare of every individual in the force. He also brought his concepts of effectiveness and efficiency into management and operations. During these years, he helped in a large measure to build and to maintain today's Air Force. This was his contribution as Vice Chief and later as Chief of Staff. Under his leadership, this force continued to grow as a global instrument of national policy, kept at an all-time peak of efficiency and strength. To accomplish his purpose, he frequently stated his beliefs to the Congress.
Well, don't you think, General May, that unless the things that you and the Air Force have recommended be done with reference to SAC, the American people may be living under a false illusion?
I can agree with you on that. I would like to make one statement, however, in this atmosphere of Sputniks and intercontinental missiles and accusations and denials that seem to be flying around the atmosphere these days. And that is, I don't think any of us should be panicked by the fact that apparently our potential enemy is ahead of us in an armament race, or at least a portion of it. I still think there's time to catch up. It is also true that in past years, the force we had in peacetime, organized into units, was not expected to fight in combat. It was the nucleus on which we built our Army after war was declared. That isn't true at the present time. We will fight and win or lose with what we have in being at the time. I think the decision as to what the ultimate outcome of the war will be will be decided by the people that are on duty at the time war that breaks out.
But there is always more to a man than appears at official functions and in official photographs. There was the off-the-cuff LeMay, master of the no-comment shrug and of the blunt remark. There is the legendary LeMay, the cigar-smoking Iron Man whose aircraft wouldn't dare explode from the angry spark of his cigar. No record has ever been kept of the number of these consumed by the general in times of stress, or even in moments of relaxation, or almost smiling ease. How did he know so much about the mission to Regensburg? A forgetful congressman asked him once. I led it, the general said, and plugged the temporary hole in his face with a cigar. There was also the ubiquitous LeMay, on his way to Thule and bringing the troops an entertaining friend. Arriving in Honolulu with his wife to check into Air Force Family Services affairs, and warmly welcomed, but only briefly garlanded with native growth. With the Joint Chiefs for a meeting at SAC headquarters, and an exchange of highly classified shop talk. There were other LeMays, each one valid for the time and place in which each one appeared, encouraging a boy to listen to the world, presenting an Air Force Cross to the son of a pilot killed in Vietnam. He never had too much to say, and yet he made his point. Was a sudden rise in Soviet strength anything to worry about? I don't worry about it, LeMay replied. What about the balance of terror in the world? I don't know any balance of terror, he said. I'm not terrified. My friends are not terrified. Personally, he lived as if he knew tomorrow would be all right. Because he had taken care of everything he had to do today. Of his official remarks, made when he had to make a speech, perhaps the most pertinent express his own estimation of his professional self. I am, he said, a military conservative, in that I believe we should not discard a proven, reliable weapon system or concept unless we have something to replace it and do a better job. But, he added, I call myself a military liberal, in that I believe we should go forward as quickly as possible in technology to gain radical strategic advantages. We need, without question, to acquire a space capability at the earliest practical date. Thus, General Curtis Emerson LeMay, the man, Chief of Staff, United States Air Force.
Today, at this very moment, the regular establishment of the United States Air Force, your Air Force Reserve, and the Air National Guard units are at an all-time peak of combat readiness. Through common purpose, mutual understanding, mutual respect, we are capable and ready